In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
You know, one of the things about humans, if you go back again, studying psychology and evolutionary psychology, we're very good at figuring out, how do I fit in? How do I make myself safe in this environment? And the way we do that is by fitting in and not standing out too much. And so if you're looking at your organization and you're saying, wow, there's a lot of things happening I don't like, we're not innovative enough, we're not creative enough, we're not nice enough, we're not X, Y, and Z enough, it usually isn't the individual person. It is almost always the environment.
I'm Aga Bajer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabajer.com/podcast. Hello, and welcome to episode 53. I know that I say this a lot, but I really loved this interview. We recorded it towards the end of 2019, and my guest, Mike Ganino, is someone I met in New Jersey last summer. He was one of the facilitators of a workshop that I attended, and I was really blown away by his ability to pull a compelling narrative out of something that sounded, frankly, like someone's stream of consciousness. And he did it in the moment, on stage, with probably close to 300 eyeballs staring at him. Really impressive. So towards the end of this interview, we will try to recreate this to a certain extent. But this time, I'm going to be Mike's lab rat, and you'll hear him coaching me live to identify a story that demonstrates why simplicity is an important value for my company. Okay, so let me say a few words about Mike, and you can find out more about him in the show notes. So Mike is someone who helps people to communicate, engage, and connect. He is the author of Company Culture for Dummies, and he is also the creator and host of a cool new podcast called The Mic Drop Moment. I think that the most prominent thread that runs through this conversation is the power of narrative that we use to make sense of our lives, both in professional and personal context. And I think that while most of us can relate to this idea that the story that we are telling ourselves shapes our lives, we often forget that the stories that we share in a family, in a team, in a group, in an organization, they are equally important. So here we go. Here is Mike and I having a chat about all this. Enjoy. So Mike, welcome to the Culture Lab.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to come here and share with everybody.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you. We met in July this year in HPS, and I was really blown away by some of your sessions, and we'll talk about this later on. So I'm really psyched to have you on the podcast. Could you briefly introduce yourself to our listeners so that they can hear a few things from you as well?
Yeah, so I'm Mike Ganino. Hi, listener. And I'm the author of Company Culture for Dummies in the Dummies series. And before that, I spent 20 years in the hospitality, restaurant, retail world, really growing brands. So taking concepts that maybe had one or 5 or 6 locations and helping them set themselves up to grow. And the interesting thing I saw along the way was that even if you had the same exact design and the same exact policies and procedures, that you didn't end up with the same environment in every single location. And of course, you could look and say, okay, well, yeah, people are different. But if you're growing an organization, if you're even opening a satellite office, it's critical to be able to have a similar culture in each place. And so I was really curious about what that was. And I spent most of my career really diving into what is it that creates a different environment, even if everything else is the same? And that's what I spent 20 years working in the industry doing, growing brands. I sold several restaurant brands that I was a partner in. And about 5 years ago, moved into this space being a public speaker and now author. And I now spend my days talking to organizations and people about storytelling and how storytelling impacts and influences what people do inside of organizations and really in general.
I love it. And I can't wait to talk more about this. And first of all, before I met you, I was not even aware that someone had written Company Culture for Dummies. And then I discovered that not only someone did it, but it was you. And I think it's really awesome because one of the biggest challenges I believe that we have today is we need to make this topic of culture more accessible to people. So tell me, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person when you were a kid?
For me, I think it was I grew up not with a lot. We grew up, relatively poor and didn't have a lot of things. And one of the things I remember thinking and considering was that regardless of what situation you're in, you always control the perspective. You always control the frame at which you view it through. So you can't decide as a kid whether you are going to be poor or wealthy, whether you're going to be born into a certain race or be born into a certain country or be born into a certain gender identity. None of those things are things you can control. But what you can control is the frame at which you view that through. And for me, that was always really interesting. And I never really considered how that might impact me later. But I remember saying, even though this is where I am, or even though this is where things are, I can control the frame at which I view this. And I can view this as a jumping off point, or I can view this as a dead end. And, for me, I always try to view it as a jumping off point of saying, okay, how could I leverage this and how could I use this to get where I want to go?
Mm.
And so for me, these really kind of early cultural thinking, cultural thoughts were about how culture is ultimately a set of stories that we tell ourselves, stories that we tell other people. And if that's true, then we can find new pieces of the story to highlight and share in order to get where we want to go.
Wow, that is fascinating. And I'm thinking of you being a boy and having that realization. Was there a specific moment when you had that insight that it's the frame that matters? Do you remember?
I mean, I wish I could say. I wish I was like, but it was on January 11th of
Yeah.
1989. I was playing Nintendo. But I think sometimes, so often, these things that we look back and think about, we can better define them and explain them in with hindsight of looking back and saying, oh, that's what I was thinking or doing. And actually, I think that's a prime example of storytelling and power. Of we look at the past and we try to weave a story out of it, even if there wasn't a story there before. We try to weave one. But I mean, I think for me it was probably when my mom and dad were getting divorced and we were moving from where we had grown up, or at that point I was 9, and moving from where we had always lived with my dad and my mom and everybody, moving to a new place and starting new schools and starting new friends and starting this whole new life. I also was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the same time. And I think at that, I remember thinking at that, all of those times of like, this can be an example of me telling myself that everything is broken and wrong and I can sit in despair. Or this can be a time for me to say, okay, these are just elements of a much bigger story. And what do I want that story to be? And I remember thinking things like that at the time. And I think that became really how I viewed everything all the way through high school, through coming out as a gay man, through the experiences I had in the corporate world. I always thought, how is this just one chapter or one element in the story I'm creating? And I think that started, way back at 9 years old, maybe even before that. But I remember specifically thinking those kinds of things at 9 years old.
And so at 9 years old, do you remember what was that story that you wanted to write, the other elements of your story? Did you envision yourself somewhere at some point in your life? One of the frequent questions that people get is, who did you want to become, or what job did you want to have in the future? But I'm more curious generally, what story um, did you imagine for yourself, or did you want to write as a 9-year-old boy?
I remember really specifically kind of three things. One is that I knew no matter what I was doing, I wanted to be happy. I wanted to be able to look at my circumstances and say, I'm happy. I think now as a 39-year-old person, I've realized that that was something that was my decision all along. But I remember feeling like I want to be happy. I want to be happy. That's what I want. That was one thing. Two is that I really enjoyed communicating. I mean, from an early age, I loved putting on little shows, putting on little concerts. I would get my sister to play a character in some kind of play I would make up. Sometimes she was just like a tree or an animal in my little plays. But I always remember I wanted to be entertaining and performing and being in front of people. That was something that was really critical to me. And I think through the rest of my life, I always sought out ways to do that. Even if I was,
Mm-hmm.
a corporate trainer, I wanted to be the one who was leading group workshops and things like
Yeah.
that. So I knew that was important for me. And three, and this is like a deeper thing, is that I wanted to feel not broken. At the time, with being diagnosed type 1 diabetic, my parents getting divorced, us moving, us being, the poor people, I always felt broken. And I
Mm.
remember wanting to feel not broken. And since then I've grown and I've learned, and I see that none of us are ever really broken. We are
Mm.
constantly being challenged and finding things. But I remember then I wanted to be happy. I wanted to be in front of people, entertaining them and communicating with them and connecting with them. And three, I wanted to feel not broken anymore.
Wow, that's amazing. So, looking back, and it's 30 years later now, what would you say to that 9-year-old boy who wanted those three things?
That you can have it all. That all of the years coming up would be really tough. The next 10 years of going through high school and at 19 coming out, that it was all going to be tough, and that all three of those things were possible, and all three of those things were going to happen. And so to just keep doubling down on being positive. I was always that kid that was always very happy, very positive, very I was just seeking out connection and communication with everybody. And I always wanted to do the right thing and be a good boy. And so I generally had like a positive disposition, even when stuff was really dark. And so I would probably go back now 30 years and say to that guy, hey, you're going to go through a bunch of stuff, and you're going to come out on the other side. And even throughout it, you're going to be happy. You're going to be in front of people, communicating and connecting with them, and you are not broken.
Wow, I love it. Thank you for sharing that. And I can only imagine that as a 9-year-old boy, you didn't really envision yourself writing a book, Company Culture for Dummies. And yet it happened, right? And as I said, I'm so glad that this book exists, because I really think that we need to simplify some things, not to dumb them down, but to simplify. I'm very curious, what prompted you to write this book in the first place?
Well, one of the things that I remember, it's so funny. I remember way back in the early 90s, I had an aunt who was one of the very first people I ever knew who had a computer, and she taught computer science. She was teaching computer programming at a college in San Diego where I grew up. And so I would go to her house and she would have a computer, and she had the very early versions of like chat rooms and things. And I was like, oh my gosh, people are connecting and talking to each other, and you can meet people from anywhere, and you can meet people who have similar interests to you. And I thought it was so interesting. So I remember way back then in the early 90s, I got one of the very first Dummies books, because the Dummies books actually
Hmm.
started as technical books. It was the
Yeah.
very first one, I think, was MS-DOS for Dummies, which was a computer programming language. And it was all about teaching how to learn this very difficult thing and how to break it down into practical application. So I remember doing that. And then later when I started working in the restaurant industry and I got fascinated by wine, I eventually became a sommelier and a wine trainer. But when I
Mm.
first got fascinated, I got wine for dummies. And then when I was learning about religion, I got religion for dummies. And so I've had this long history of the Dummies books, of going to them when I needed a resource, when I wanted to learn something. And so one of the things I saw in the marketplace for so many of the culture books that are out there is that they're theoretical.
Hmm.
They talk very high level about why culture matters and why you should think about it and how it's great, and teaching frameworks for it. But there was very little in so many of the books, and they're great books, and they're great books for teaching why we should think about this and why it matters. But I struggled over and over as I was growing my restaurant brands. I struggled to find a book that actually said, here are a bunch of things you can go do. Because I believe that culture is not just one big thing that you swoop in and fix. It is a bunch of different stories, a bunch of different elements. And so any book that has like one simple thing you can do, I just, I don't know that that's believable. And so I really wanted to, when I started working on company culture, my talks, my speeches, my workshops were always very practical. Like, let's get it out of the way. Let's talk about why this matters. But I assume that the people were in the room because they realized it mattered. They just didn't know what to do to make it better. And so all of my workshops were always very practical in that way. All my speeches were, inspirational, motivational as they needed to be, but also included like very specific nuts and bolts of what to do. And so when I had the opportunity to write this book, I was super excited because I realized that the Dummies books, that's what they're about. They're about very practical, like people should be able to flip to the chapter on recruiting and read only that chapter and leave with 5 or 6 things they can go do today. And when I wrote it, that was my goal, that you could flip to whatever you needed and you could grab that chapter and you could get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 ideas of things you could take back to your team and say, okay, let's do it. I even in the book wrote out how to lead workshops and kind of creating your own culture lab in a way, how to actually lead it. What do you say? What do you do next? What should the process be? How long should it take? Because I realized that people didn't have that kind of information available to them.
Yeah, it's incredible. I read the book and I was really impressed with how much stuff you cover and how comprehensive it is. It's incredible. And so I think one of the challenges probably that some people might have is that they feel, oh, I maybe don't have enough time to read the whole thing in one sitting. So let's talk about some of the groups of our listeners. We definitely have entrepreneurs listening, and especially people who are in the startup world. So if they have only an hour or so on a flight and get your book, which chapter would you send them to?
I would say probably to start with, it would be one of two. I would say either read chapter 1 so you get an idea of like recognizing if your culture is in trouble and why it matters. So you could kind of understand, why do I need to do that? Chapter 1 is understanding company culture, and it has sections on defining it, understanding what it is, and understanding the symptoms of an at-risk culture. So if you could only read one thing, maybe you start there and you say, okay, how in trouble are we based on this? And if I was to be able to give them another one to skip to, I would say to go to chapter 4, which is called Managing Yourself. And it's all about, before you dive in and you do any of this work on recruiting or diversity or any of the other chapters that are in here, how do you actually manage yourself? Because I believe fundamentally, that's one of the core things we have to do to have a great culture.
Yeah, and especially as an entrepreneur, a founder or a CEO, that's super, super important. It really starts with them first. So I couldn't agree more. That's awesome. And if you are in a large corporation and you have a mature culture, it has been there for maybe decades, and you identify some issues already. So in a way, why it's dysfunctional and perhaps even what you want to change. What would be a good place to go to and look at?
I think, there's a chapter. So often I see organizations start to think about how to change things and start to have ideas of what they want to be different. And often that'll be a list of steps or a list of, bullet points or things like that. And I really think we've got to get into the narrative of it all. So I would say to jump to chapter 6. Chapter 6 talks about how to maximize your impact with your mission and your vision. And so I would say, if you have an idea about things that are going on currently that you'd like to change, you think they should be different, then I would go exactly to page 109. In fact, 109 is where the part on looking into the future starts, because I think before we can change anything, we have to have a really clear idea of what it looks like. And that's not a bullet pointed list of like, we're known as this and this is going on and this is happening. But it's actually like as if we went into the future and you were watching a day in the life of your organization in the future, and then you describe to me what it looks like. And what I find so often, whether I'm working with someone on a piece of like persuasive communication they want to share. So maybe they have a speech, or they've got a keynote coming up, or they've got a workshop coming up or something, and they want to be able to persuade people's thinking. Or in an organization, when they want to change the way people are thinking, I mean, it's the same thing really. They can't actually, the very first thing I ask them to do is to get really, really clear about what it looks like when those people are doing that thing. And you know what's so surprising is how often people can't do that. They realize that they want the world to be different, but they actually can't describe what it looks like when it's different. And I think that's a fundamental first step, because before you can put anything into your vision, before you can put anything into your story or your speech, you've got to understand if that audience, if that team that you're working with actually changes, what does that look like? And so that's where I always start.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it really is important. I think it's also a challenge for a lot of executives in multinational corporations, because they already have the vision and the mission that is coming from the HQ. So the headquarters had developed something, and sometimes it doesn't really resonate locally. And so would you say that, let's say that you are the general manager of a multinational company, and you're based in Italy, so you are responsible for the Italian operation. Would you say that you need to revisit your vision and your mission, your corporate vision and mission, and somehow tweak it or customize it so that it resonates locally?
Absolutely. I think, what's so funny is I predicted this type of question because I've worked with so many groups where they do have large multinational teams, and they've got people in different places, and they've got different offices. And even just in one office, the way that an engineering team works is different than the way a marketing team works. And I think as a leader, our job is about being, our job is largely communication. And in so many cases, our job is about being a translator, being able to take that big organizational mission, being able to take the vision for 2020. A lot of organizations are starting to roll out their, what does 2020 look like for us? Our job as leaders on smaller teams, or within countries, or within offices, or within departments, is to be able to take what the organization is aiming the organization at, what the senior level executives are aiming it at, or what the board is aiming it at, and being able to say, okay, how do I turn that into a narrative and a story for my team? How do I put them in it? And so I predicted this exact question, because so often it's what I get asked of after I speak. People will say, well, that was all great, but you've never met my boss, or you don't know my team or my company. And at the beginning of my speaking career, I often was speaking for big brands, like big hotel chains. And I couldn't go in and say, change your mission and vision, because they said, well, wait a second, you're talking to like the general managers of our hotel locations.
Yeah.
They don't get to change the mission and vision. And so there's actually chapter 15 of the book on page 253 is called Creating a Culture Pocket in the Org Chart. And a culture pocket is essentially saying, no matter what's going on in the organization, each team, each leader of a team can create a really unique space even within that. And you've seen it, right? I mean, you've gone to
Totally.
an organization, and there's that one team that somehow really gets it, or there's a great organization and there's one team that doesn't get it. So I predicted that, and I think it's possible to still do great stuff.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. And I really think that culture is very local and context is king. So while something resonates and is really important in Brazil, for example, it really is going to be different in Italy. And so I completely agree that it's all about creating those pockets of culture. I like that phrase, local pockets, where people can see how that connects to their reality. Because very often, when those huge organizations are trying to do something about their culture, it usually comes from the top. It's a huge initiative, and people feel like, it's one more of those things that has absolutely nothing to do with our work, and it's just over and above of everything else that we have to do, and it just gets us busier, but we see zero point of doing it. And I think by going locally and speaking to the local needs, you overcome that hurdle.
Totally. And it's interesting too on that same level of how frequently, if you look back at the last like 30 years when organizations have been talking about this kind of thing, and maybe they called it different things, but company culture, employee engagement, there's been so many efforts, and so few of those efforts actually make a huge impact. And I think it's because of exactly what you're saying of it's because we're trying to do these big global sweeping things and we're not thinking about how does it change specifically in this location or with this team? And I think the more that we pay attention to that, the more we actually can move the needle on engagement and company culture measures.
Yeah, absolutely. So what still surprises you when it comes to how companies and leaders approach culture?
The biggest thing that surprises me about it is that they forget that it's humans who come to work every day. that all of the psychology we know, all of the things we know about influence, persuasion, relationships, how people think, that all of those factors that we know that are studied and researched, we somehow believe that when people pull into the parking lot at work, they check that side of them and they show up as a business widget. When in reality,
Yeah.
right? We would be so much better served if we actually remembered, okay, how do people think? It's really
Mm.
surprising to me still. I don't know why it is because it happens so frequently. I'll go in and I'll work with an organization for example, I'm headed off this week to go work with an organization which is around their end of the year annual event, and I'm going to help the executive team with their messaging, with their keynote speeches. So each of the executives goes and they give a speech, and so I'm going to go work with them on the overall master narrative for the organization and then the individual ones for the speeches. And what's funny is I'm predicting ahead of time, and I bet I'm right, is that I'll walk in and they'll think, well, if we just give people information and data, they
Hmm.
will all change. But
Yeah.
no one really has ever changed in the history of the world because of information and data. They change because we have this belief that knowledge is power,
Hmm.
but that's not true because we all know what we should be eating. We know how much we should be moving. We know that we should be stressed less. We know that we should be watching our cell phones less. We all know this stuff and we don't do it
Yeah.
until there's a health problem or something. And so knowledge is not power. So we've got to tap into the emotional side of why do people do what they do and how could we use that at work to create a better environment?
Mm. So let's talk about that because I know that people have really tuned in now because of course, they realize that this is very true. It's really happening in their company probably as well. And they're like, okay, so give me some tools here. How do I tap into that emotional part? What should I be doing? So talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think it's really taking a step back and saying, one, how can I become a very good listener? Because you can't change people, including cultural shifts, culture initiatives that you want to have at work. You can't change people without understanding where they are currently. So whether you're an executive who's going to give a speech at a company conference, whether you're a leader of a team who's speaking at an all hands event, if there's somewhere where you want people to change, and most of the time when we communicate, it's about getting someone else to change. I mean, most communication is persuasive communication. We don't often sit around just to talk about nothing. We get together to get people to believe a new way or get people to like us and trust us or get people to change the way they show up at work. And in order to do that, you have to become a really great listener and you have to become quite empathetic to understand where are they currently, because you're not going to win by getting in front of people and telling them to change and not recognizing why are they scared of change, because nobody
Mhm.
wants to be met with a communicator or a leader who says, hey, you're wrong and everything you're doing is wrong.
Yeah.
What we want to be met with is, I understand why you are where you are. That makes total
Hmm.
sense to me. And so the first step really is to get really empathetic about where are people at today. The second step is to get very, very clear, like as if you were watching a movie and describing what happens, about what does it look like when it's all going the right way. And that can't
Hmm.
be vague language. That can't be things are great. Well, great how? Great like there's ice cream party every day, or great like you're exceeding your business goals and people are treating each
Yeah.
other in X, Y, and Z way. So those are really the first two steps. And often just through doing that, it becomes, so often in the workshops I do with leadership teams, those two questions become almost like little therapy sessions for them.
Yeah, totally. And I can't, I just want to underscore that because really gaining that understanding of why people are where they are, as you say. It's so, so, so important. And I think for most leaders, they are driven by their own frustration that things are not going the way they want them to be going. So they don't even want to stop and look at what things look like right now and what are potentially some historical reasons that people are still behaving in a particular way, or they are at this point. So this is so, so important. And sometimes I think listening and being empathetic is super important. And sometimes it takes a little bit more than that even, because often we don't know why we are where we are ourselves. So we have a blind spot. And I think it's important for leaders, and this is where the real empathy comes in, where you need to observe and you need to put those culture goggles or whatever you want to call it, right? And really tune in to stuff that is not being said, and perhaps even stuff that people are not even aware of. But when you see people like that, and when you really understand people like that, I think this is really where magic happens.
Well, and you're exactly right. It's this idea also of we have to, when you think about culture, it is the way it is. This is the other thing I would say. If there was a third thing, you don't need new people. You don't need more creative people. You don't need kinder people, any of those things. I mean, you may have like really bad people, but in general, what I have found is that the people that are there are the right people. Mm. We all change based on the environments we're in. We're very good as one of the things about humans, if you go back again, studying psychology and evolutionary psychology, we're very good at figuring out, how do I fit in? How do I make myself safe in this environment? And the way we do that is by fitting in and not standing out too much. And so if you're looking at your organization and you're saying, wow, there's a lot of things happening I don't like, we're not innovative enough, we're not creative enough, we're not nice enough, we're not X, Y, and Z enough, it usually isn't the individual person. It is almost always the environment. And so if you're looking at your organization, you're listening, you're being empathetic, the third thing you can do is say, okay, they're acting in a perfect way. So like the way that they're acting, the behaviors I'm seeing, the results I'm getting are perfect based on the environment they're in. What do we need to change about the environment? Because that's usually the problem, not the person.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, just to illustrate that point, give a little bit of color and texture to that. I recently had a meeting with a guy who worked for one of those multinational organizations, and he used to be based in Italy. And the branch in Italy, it was 10 years ago though. And he went away and did the whole expat thing, traveling around the world. And he recently visited the Italian branch again. And he told me, it's incredible because it's been 10 years. And they had 100% turnover. So everyone who is there today is a new person. So I haven't met any of the old colleagues. And the shocking thing is, because the environment was the same, the culture was the same, that he says the culture is exactly the same. It used to be 10 years ago. So people are different, but it's still the same company. So it can happen, and it does happen that, you get the best people, but if you don't fix that environment, you are still going to get the same results. So I want us to explore one of the areas that you alluded to, which is how we communicate and the narratives and the stories that we tell. Why are stories such an important tool in shaping cultures, Mike? I know that this is one of the areas that you are really obsessed with, stories, right? And crafting compelling stories. So I'm really curious to hear from you. What is it about stories that is so, so powerful?
I think the first thing about stories that is so powerful is that we just can't get away from them. Like, we think in them. We look back at our previous data. We look back at even the questions you asked me about when I first recognized culture, or something that happened to me and I was talking about being a kid. Like, is that actually factually true statements? I don't know, but it's my truth based on how I look back at it. Mm-hmm. We can't avoid telling stories. When you go home at night and somebody says, "How was work today?" We don't say, I arrived at 9:01 a.m. At 9:05, I checked my email. At 9:10, I got a coffee. We don't do that. What we do is we weave it into a narrative because our brain is obsessed with making sense of things in that way. And stories really are the ultimate vessel for inspiring action, for creating connection, for engaging an audience, mostly because we just can't stop sharing them.
Mm-hmm.
And over and over, there's so much research at this point around the things we remember are the stories. And even if we look back and the story is slightly off, or the story is slightly not exactly what happened, which is often the case, we can't help but weave our experiences into stories. We quite literally, as humans, are our stories. And so what better way to communicate with people than to help either create a new story for them or to tell them a story about what's going on and what could be going on. And I just think you have no better shot at being able to actually influence change than using stories.
Mm. So, what are the key elements to think about when you want to craft a compelling story?
The key, oh, this is so funny because it goes back to what we were just saying. The very first thing that you have to do is to say, well, where am I taking them? So if I'm about to communicate something that needs to change in the business, or I'm about to teach a lesson, or I'm about to tell a story about our values, the first thing you have to decide before you start thinking about what do they know currently? What do I want to say? What are the details? What needs to be involved? The very first thing you should do is start with the end. What's the
Mm.
resolution? How does this thing end? And then we can work backwards and see it. And the challenge, it's so funny how often somebody will say, okay, well, I'm going to tell this story. And I'll say, great. How does it end? And how does it end for the person who's listening? Like, what is
Mm.
different because they listened? And it's so funny how often we start talking and we don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, you are trying to figure out what is the impact that you want to make on your audience, right? And how do you want to change them through this story?
Absolutely, because then it allows you to say, okay, if this is where I want them to go, then now you have a measurement of whether it worked. You know, organizations always want to talk about the ROI, the return on investment. Well, let's do that with your stories. Let's do that with your communication. If you're talking about the history of your company and how you started, then what is the ROI on that? That somebody took a test and they can say that the company started in 1949? Is that really valuable? Or is the return on investment that in some specific way they've changed, or they've done something different, or they believe something because of it? What is the true thing that changes because they know that the company started in 1949?
Mm.
Then you can actually start to measure whether it was impactful or not.
Right. So you define how you want your audience to change. Where do you want to take them? What do you want to be different as a result of your story? And what do you do next?
Well, and so once you've got your clear resolution of not only how does the story end, but also what do they do? What's the story's, kind of dessert, if you will? If the
Hmm.
ending of the story is like the main meal, then the dessert is that these people go and do something different because they've been here, or they feel
Yeah.
differently. So once you have that down, then you say to yourself, okay, so where are they at currently? So if that's where I want them to go, where are they at currently? Because that also dictates to you how much information to put in. If you say, well, I really want this leader to believe that company culture matters, I say, okay, great. Here's a story I can use. Here's what I want them to do differently. And then I could look at it and say, well, actually, they're kind of almost all the way there. They're doing pretty good work already. They already believe in company culture. They just need a couple of different things to do. That's a very different story that I need to tell them than somebody who says, well, company culture is fluffy and it doesn't matter and it doesn't do anything. If I were to go to both of those people and say the same thing, I'm not going to get the result I want, because I have to consider, where are they starting from? What's the
Hmm.
current narrative they have around this? And then because I have to accept it. I have to say, hey, I know how you feel. You probably feel this way. And in fact, in my book, that's how it starts. Company culture can feel fluffy and light, and it feels like happy hours and nap rooms and free massages. But the reality is that's not what it really is. And so if you're feeling fed up by all of that, join the crowd, because I am too. It's
Mm.
about something much bigger. And so but if somebody already is all the way there, if I'm communicating with you, for example, you've already bought in. I don't need to start at the same
Totally.
place with you.
Yeah. And so you demonstrate that empathy basically, and you're telling me, I know where you are. I understand what it's like to be you. And I think this is what makes people to really tune in, right? Because they feel, oh, it's relevant then. And this person has done their homework. They know me, they understand me, they see me. So I can totally see how that works. So you clarify where you want them to go and what action you want them to take as a result of your story. You figure out where they are right now and what their reality is right now. And what do you do next?
And then next you say, okay, well, if that's where I want them to go, and this is where they are currently, now I have to start thinking about, okay, so what are some examples of what I could share? And depending on what the problem you're actually trying to solve, it may be that the story you need to tell is about the origin of the company and why it started and why that still matters today. And by the way, for everybody listening, if you're doing new hire orientations, the part of your orientation that's about the history of the company, spoiler alert, it's not about the history of the company. It should be about why the fact that the company exists today still matters and has been true all along. That's what we're doing there. And so if we just tell the history of the company, nobody remembers that. We don't remember a lot of facts from our history books, but we remember specific stories and what they can teach us about today. So maybe it's your origin story. Maybe it's a time when the organization was challenged. Maybe it's a value story. Maybe it's a story about customer service. So once you figure out what story you need to use, then it's going through and saying, okay, well, based on that, how do I go find relevant examples? How do I become a story collector? And how do I kind of dip into the bucket and think through, okay, where are times where we've actually done this? And how do I pull that story out? And then once you've done that, then you can get deeper into how to weave it together.
Yeah. So let's stay with this for a moment, because I think a challenge for a lot of our listeners is that they feel like, yeah, it's easy for you to say, but it's really difficult for me to think of those stories. I don't know. I really can't think of anything. How do you source these stories? Do you have any advice for our listeners to, I don't know, create a collection of stories that they might find useful in the future, or find one that you are looking for, and you just rack your brain and you can't think of anything?
Yeah, so I mean, I have like a whole little guide that we can tell people to go to that has, the 5 main stories you need to be able to tell, and I think probably like 100 different prompts to think about them. But let's talk about that. You're wanting to communicate about change or communicate about some kind of change that's coming up or challenge you've faced. So maybe you ask yourself things like, okay, so in regards to this topic, how did it all begin? When was the part when you realized that change needed to happen specifically? Where were you sitting? What was going on? What did the world look like before and what happened then? What was the thing that sparked it into action? Another question you might ask is, what was the big challenge that was being faced? Like, why couldn't you just go do it? If you wanted to solve some kind of issue for customers, why couldn't you just go do it? And why did it matter that it couldn't get done? What were the actual stakes? What was happening to people because of it? What were the people involved feeling? What was it that they wanted? And why did that matter to them specifically? What specifically did they do? What actions did they take? What did they try? How did it get resolved? What did that specifically look like? So those are all about, kind of objections and things like that. When you think about your origin story, because I know a lot of folks who listen might be the ones who are telling about the future of the company. Where are we headed? What's the vision, right? These are thought leaders and visionaries for the organization. So you might ask, in what ways do you believe the world could be different than today? Specifically, what does that promised land look like? How will the future be different because your product, company, team, service existed? How do people specifically benefit? And if it's about your customer, what have they achieved because of that? What have they achieved that they don't even know they want, but they will want later? When has someone else done this in the world? Has it ever been done before? What did they do to achieve it? Maybe it's that you're telling employees that they need to change and be giving better service. Well, we all need an example. We need a hero. So who is someone who has done it before? And so it's really asking the question of, when was the moment, if you're the founder, when was the moment that you said, there's a better way? I think this could be so much better. That's
Mm-hmm.
the origin story of the company, not that you started in 1998 and you did this, but when was that moment that you said, enough is enough? Someone's got to do something about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be so, so powerful. I just came back from Asia, from an amazing program that is called Unreasonable Impact. And basically, what it does is it supports entrepreneurs who are trying to solve what this company, the Unreasonable Group, calls big fucking problems, like illiteracy, and climate change and pollution and so on and so forth. So they have founded companies that have a social impact. And we were doing a lot of fireside conversations, and they were sharing those origin stories with the rest of the group. And it was so incredible to hear about those moments when, the light bulb went on and they were like, there must be a better way. And I think for a lot of founders, without that prompt, they don't really share that story often enough. And it can be extremely inspiring for their teams, for sure. So this is amazing. Thank you for that. I think this is very, very useful for our listeners. And I know that you have tools on your website. So we're going to post the links to your website and to the tools if people are curious to learn more about how to craft compelling stories. And one thing that I want to ask you is whether you are up for an experiment. This is a culture lab, so we're all about experimentation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the sessions that really completely blew my mind was the story of your brand, where basically you gave us some questions and we were thinking about the story of our brand. And then we had this chat before we start recording, and I asked you, do you think that it would be possible to do a little demo of how you can start thinking about the story of our culture? And the initial idea was that one of our listeners would join us, but I think people felt a little bit shy. And so I think that it would be interesting though to see how this process might work. So I'm willing to be the lab rat. And can we do a little bit of a demo how to construct the story of your culture? Just like a 5-minute one or even less.
I love it. Yeah, let's.
Okay.
I love a willing volunteer.
All right, so I'm all yours. Let's go.
Okay, so the big thing that so often organizations think about when they start to think about culture is they'll talk about the values. So maybe just as a small experiment, we focus on the organizational values. And so when you think about the team that you have, what are some of the values that you would say, either that you've explicitly said that you've written down and said these are our values, or that you've outlined as values that you have? What are some of those?
So we have 4 values, and we have identified them and have written them down. And one of them is simplicity. Another one is impact. The third one is connection, and finally co-creation. So I don't know if you'd like me to elaborate a little bit on any of them or all of them.
Nice. So when you think of simplicity, for example, how do you define that to the team?
So I want us to be able to create really clear messages and make the complex stuff really simple. Because I believe that the real power lies in simplicity. And so what we're trying to do, all of us are trying to do, is to first of all break things down into parts and see what is not necessary, and then put it back together into something that is more streamlined and simpler. So for example, when we design a workshop for a client, we look at it with this critical eye. Do we really need it? Is the message really clear here? Even the emails that we send, we are really conscious about not being too wordy and finding the right words to express the messages. So, instead of saying something in 2 sentences, the ideal is let's try and say it in 1 short sentence, for example.
Perfect. So typically in an organization, you have these values that are one word or maybe like a short little phrase, just like you have these four. And then there's a definition of it like you have. Simplicity means we're trying to create clear messaging and, break complex ideas down to the most simplest form, which is great. That's exactly what normally that's what you should do. That's what we put into it. Now, one of the things that I think makes it even more powerful is to say, how can we tell some stories about it? And we're looking for two specific kinds of stories. Now, you may have different actual stories. There's two categories of stories, and you may have three or four for each. But the two types of stories are, one is related to a value isn't really a value unless it's something you have to strive to do. Meaning, I can't say that I value not punching people in the face because that's not hard. I don't ever have the desire to punch people in the face. So I'm never really being challenged on that. And so often, I mean, think about it. How many times you see an organization that has a value that you're like, well, is that really a value, or that's just like that's just like a given? Like, you should just be doing that.
Totally.
And
like
so
integrity or teamwork or whatever.
Yeah. Teamwork is the one I see all the time. And it's like, okay, well, sure, that can be a value, but let's dive in here. So when you think about simplicity, there's two categories that we're going to talk about really quick, and then people can use this as an example for themselves. One is why simplicity is difficult, and a time where you didn't do it and the result was bad. So you weren't focused on the value of simplicity, and so the message wasn't clear, or the complex thing wasn't broken down, and it impacted results in a negative way. Can you think of an example of that?
Oh God, yes, definitely.
Okay. So then,
yeah.
So what is that example? What was the time that you say, oh, this is what happened?
So really briefly, we use a diagnostic tool. It's an online survey to take a snapshot of the current culture in an organization. And it's quite a complex tool. It's not a tool that we have developed, but I see a lot of value in using it. But what we learned to do with this tool is help people understand the results and break them down so that it's digestible. And we learned it the hard way, because on the first project that we used this tool, we didn't simplify the messaging, and the report that the client gets is like 300 pages or something like that. So of course, we didn't just jump into the workshop and say, here is the report, 300 pages, let's have a look. But still, the simplification that we have done wasn't enough, and people were confused. They didn't know what to focus on, and it felt like going away from the workshop, there was a long shopping list of things that they might need to do, but lack of clarity or where to focus their energy. And as you can imagine, of course, the impact of that is that there's not enough momentum to get things moving. People spread themselves too thin. So we had to take some corrective actions afterwards, and that's never ideal, of course, when people walk away. And it cost us a lot of time and a lot of effort, and I think it was also frustrating for the client as well. So that was a big learning, and from now on, we know that it's good for us to have this information, but we need to make sure that we present it to the client in a way that is going to facilitate the process of them gaining clarity rather than the other way around.
Perfect. So I always call these anti-value stories, because what you're doing is you're taking your value of simplicity and you're saying, well, most organizations, how they communicate their values is to say, this is what we value and it's wonderful. And if they do tell a story about it, they just tell a very basic anecdotal story about how, they just woke up one day and everything was perfect and they always believed in simplicity. But that's not the truth. You believe in simplicity because you learned a lesson around it. And so I believe we need to tell a story that highlights a time when we screwed up. And that's how think about movies that you go and watch.
Yeah. Totally.
We want to watch movies about characters who go through trouble. And so I always say for every value, you need two categories of stories. And you may have 5, 10, 20, 30 stories, but you have two categories. One is your anti-value, like what you just shared. Now, if we were working together, I would then ask you questions like, okay, great, let's start at the beginning then. So help us understand the context. Who was involved? What did they want? What did this organization want from you? What were they hoping for? What were they excited about? And then tell us every day what was happening, what was going on, what were all the basic details. And then one day something changed, which is you had them come and they did this diagnostic tool, and it was going to be so great because it was 300 pages. It was going to give them all of the information they needed and really, really a broad view of what was going on so they could understand it. Well, because of that, you gave them a 300-page document. And because of that, they had this huge long list of to-dos. And it took a lot of time and effort on your part and a lot of time and effort on their part. And because of that, they actually didn't end up using much of it. They felt overwhelmed and not happy. And then, of course, we weren't happy because we didn't get the result until finally we realized what we needed to do was make this digestible. We needed to take the complex and simplify it so that we could actually do the work that they came to us for, which was to help them in this way. So ever since then, we've believed in simplicity. We know that X, Y, and Z matters, which is why we do A, B, and C. That's the way we should be communicating values. So that's the anti-value story. And I actually think the anti-value story is the most effective way to communicate values because it shows you as an organization or you as a leader going through a challenge that then people can say, okay, I get it. Now, anti-value is one category of story, and the other is just an actual value story. So you would talk about a time when an employee actually used the value and saved the day. So we were always so busy and people would send these very detailed emails because they wanted to make sure everyone was getting the information, yada, yada, yada. But one day somebody sent a really long email and because of that, nobody paid attention to it. And because of that, this one thing got missed. And because of that, our client or whatever, something bad happened until finally Carol came along and Carol started communicating in this really simple way. She believed that what could we say in one sentence that would do the thing? And ever since then, we've all been focusing on being more simple and clear in our communications with each other so that people understand what's going on. And that's why we believe in simplicity. And that's how we use it every day.
Mike, this for me is a mic drop moment, really. I just love it so much. It's so helpful. And I think the way you narrated these stories, they are short and brief and so powerful. I think it's going to be super, super useful for our listeners. Thank you so much for doing that. This was awesome and also very, very useful for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Love it. And I imagine that, when you are a leader in an organization, of course, you create a collection of these stories, right, with the help of your colleagues. And then it's really important to kind of share these stories with your team members or with people who join and so on and so forth, right?
Absolutely. And think about trainers or leaders who are doing orientations for new hires.
Mm-hmm.
Think about when you're doing an all hands meeting, how can you leverage a story to communicate the message? How can you put the message inside of a story that people say, oh my gosh, I was following along and get it? Because if we're just preaching to them about bullet points and information, it's not as impactful. But when you weave it into this and you start sharing them, then other people can share them. Because think about it. If you as a leader, if you told that story about simplicity and the time when you did this 300-page diagnostic tool and why it was so bad, someone else can now take that story that you shared and they can then make it their story that they share as well. Because they'll remember the details so much better. Because we tend to think in cause and effect. This happened, which caused this to happen. And so if you start sharing that story about simplicity, the other people on your team can pick it up and start sharing it much more easily as well.
Yeah, love it. I wish we had more time because I have so many questions, but I know that we have a limitation. You have another meeting to go to. So let's move to the rapid fire questions. Okay. And I ask these questions to all our guests. There are 5 questions here, and our aim is to answer them in under 2 minutes. Okay? Are you ready?
Okay.
All right,
ready.
let's go for it. So the first one, how do you define organizational culture?
Organizational culture is the stories that everyone believes that dictate how they act at work.
And what is the sign or signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
The biggest sign that a company needs work is that the desired outcome is not what's happening. And so if that's the case, it's just a story issue. It's just a culture issue. If you've got sad people, angry people, unhappy people, unproductive people, it's an environmental issue, not a people issue.
And are there any companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
My favorite one is a company called Zingerman's out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. They've got 17 different businesses, but it's all centered around this original deli that opened. And the biggest reason why is I think they're insanely curious. They're curious about why work is the way it is and what they can do to make it different. And because of that, they've been able to create some of the most amazing systems and ideas. So Zingerman's in Ann Arbor, Michigan is my favorite.
Awesome. And we're going to post a link to their website then as well for our listeners. And what books on culture or on leadership would you recommend? I would definitely recommend Company Culture for Dummies. But what are your recommendations?
Well, thank you for that. I think I have three specifically. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown's new book, Dare to Lead. I think it's a really great book about what we need more in leadership. I'm a huge fan of Ari Weinzweig, who is one of the founders of Zingerman's, actually. He has a series of 4 books, but I really, really love his book called The Power of Beliefs. And how beliefs change what happens at work. That's a huge favorite of mine. And then the other one I would say that people should be checking out, it's actually a newer one that I just read, and I really love the thinking behind it. It's called The Fearless Organization, and the author's last name is Edmondson. I really thought there was some great stuff in there.
Yeah, she's great. She's great. I love that book as well. But I haven't read the book about beliefs, so I'm really looking forward to checking it out. Thank you.
It's so good.
Oh, I'm looking forward to reading it then. And so what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
The biggest thing they can do in that way is to sit down and talk about when that vision comes to life, what does it actually look like? Like very specifically, sit down and describe when we achieve the thing, even if you're just a leader of a small team and you're working on a project, even if you're just a project manager, what does it look like when this is all going well? Let's describe it in clear, specific language. That's the number one thing, which is also really, honestly, if you think about the values exercise that we just did, that's all I did there was say, describe it clearly so we understand it. That's where I'd start.
Totally. Wonderful. So finally, what I want to ask, so we're done with the rapid fire questions, but I want to ask you if you have a guest to recommend, someone who you think has interesting stuff to share about company culture or leadership, or perhaps a leader who has been successful in creating an amazing culture. Who should I have as a guest?
I recently met this person and started watching some of their speeches and some of the things they're saying. And I'm such a huge fan of this approach, and it's something that's needed. Her name is Christina Blacken, and she talks about inclusivity and change and what's going on and what matters and how to leverage communication and storytelling to change the culture when it comes to inclusivity. And I'm really finding what she's saying fresh and different and needed. So Christina Blacken, I'd love to hear an episode with her.
Awesome. And do you know her personally?
Yes.
Could you connect us?
Of course I will. I'd be so happy to do that.
Thank you so much. So finally, would you like to leave our listeners with some final words? Anything that you believe is important before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I think the last thing I would say is go back to what I said about being that 9-year-old boy and recognizing that none of us are broken. Our cultures are not broken. The people inside of them are not broken. We as leaders are not broken. That is not true. We simply are getting the results we're getting because of the stories we're telling and the stories people are telling themselves inside of the organization. And if that is true, if you believe me, then you can change those stories. And I think that's worth doing.
I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabajer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabajer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. And now it's time for the preview of the upcoming episode. My next guest is Jitske Kramer. She's someone who travels the world to learn from traditional healers, leaders, surprising innovators, and random passers-by. She looks at the world and at organizations through the eyes of an anthropologist. She's always looking for ways to build strong tribes and to reinforce the relationships between people. In this preview, she talks about the importance of balance between two forces that fuel modern tribes: power and love.
If you state as an organization, let's say you want to be customer oriented, so you want to have the customer first in every decision you take, then you have to drive that. And there has to be a power push behind it, because you have to get rid of all the procedures which are in the way of this target or this purpose you set out to reach, right? So you need to take risks, and it's challenging and it's powerful, and you keep on going. So it's kind of setting the dopamine in the system, and it's a runner's high and bam, 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 bam. If you only have that, then you end up with a bunch of back-to-back meetings, and you kind of feel lost, and it's burning energy. You'll die eventually. So you have to balance it with the force I like to call love, and which is about connection. And it's almost like power is like you're carrying a torch, and then when you put all the torches together, you have this campfire. And at the campfire, there's the love bit where you say, well, we are one tribe. We don't have to fight our way in. We're here and we are loyal to each other. We trust each other. We don't have to battle for trust. I just ask, how are you?
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.